The war isn't just on the battlefield anymore. It's turning personal and darker. Russian officials are calling Volodymyr Zelensky a war criminal, demanding he be captured alive, and warning his fate could mirror Jeffrey Epstein. Missiles strike, rhetoric spirals. So is this still a war of territory, or something far more dangerous unfolding? Tensions between Moscow and Kiev have escalated sharply, with senior Russian figures issuing increasingly hostile rhetoric against Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as the conflict continues to intensify. In a series of statements, Russian officials have openly threatened severe consequences for Zelensky, portraying him as a criminal who must face punishment. Mikhail Sheremet, a Russian-installed official in annexed Crimea, described the Ukrainian leader as a war criminal.
I consider Volodymyr Zelensky a criminal, a war criminal who will sooner or later face the punishment he deserves. Everyone around him will end up with a fate similar to Jeffrey Epstein's.
The remarks reflect growing frustration within Moscow as Russia faces continued pressure on the battlefield. Colonel General Andrei Kartapolov, chairman of Russia's Parliamentary Defense Committee, also called for Zelensky to be captured alive and put on trial.
We need Zelensky alive so that he can be brought to justice for all his crimes against his own people, first and foremost, and against the people of Russia. We need someone who is capable of organizing the signing of these very peace agreements once we reach them.
Kartapolov further escalated tensions by warning that Russia could strike any country accused of supporting Ukraine's potential development of nuclear capabilities.
We would be obliged to strike at the country that has taken such a reckless step. Escalate was nipped in the bud. Sir Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz are among the Western leaders who would soon be consigned to the dustbin of history and replaced by those ready to kowtow to Putin.
Meanwhile, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev used similarly harsh language, dismissing Zelensky's leadership and questioning the legitimacy of his potential political future.
The stinky dog seriously hopes to hold elections in the dying country, rise from the ashes, and regain his legitimate status. This was Zelensky's only chance to stay alive.
Despite the intensifying war of words, the conflict on the ground shows no signs of easing. Ukrainian forces have continued to strike strategic targets, including industrial and military facilities. One recent operation reportedly damaged key infrastructure at the Alshevsk metallurgical combine in the Luhansk region. At the same time, Russia has been accused of targeting civilian-linked assets. Reports indicate that grain-exporting vessels in Ukraine's Odessa region were struck while being loaded, with the port of Chornomorsk coming under sustained drone attacks overnight. The ships were reportedly flagged under Barbados and Palau. As the war enters its prolonged phase, both military operations and political rhetoric appear to be escalating in parallel. The increasingly personal nature of the statements from Russian officials signals a deepening confrontation, not only on the battlefield, but also in the broader narrative surrounding the conflict. Tensions between Russia and European powers have escalated sharply after Moscow reportedly dismissed France's attempt to play a role in negotiations over the war in Ukraine, underlining deep divisions over how the conflict should be resolved. According to a Financial Times report, Russian officials delivered a blunt message to French representatives, effectively rejecting any meaningful European participation in potential peace talks. The reported response reflects Moscow's growing frustration with European nations, which it accused of aligning too closely with Ukraine and the United States. The exchange is said to have occurred during diplomatic talks in which France sought to position itself, along with other European countries, as a mediator in efforts to end the war. However, Russia appears to have made clear that it does not view Europe as a neutral actor.
The Russian response from Ushakov was basically, "Sorry, actually, no, we don't. You."
The reported remark, while unusually direct in diplomatic terms, highlights the increasingly confrontational tone that has characterized relations between Russia and the West since the start of the war. France, under President Emmanuel Macron, has repeatedly argued that Europe must have a central role in shaping any future settlement in Ukraine, given the continent's security interests and the war's direct impact on European stability. However, Moscow has consistently pushed back against this idea, accusing European governments of prolonging the conflict through military and financial support to Ukraine. Russian officials argue that countries supplying weapons to Kiev cannot simultaneously act as credible mediators. The latest exchange suggests that Russia is instead prioritizing direct engagement with the United States, which it sees as the primary decision-maker behind Western support for Ukraine.
The Europeans don't want to help the peace process. When the representative of France came, he didn't bring any positive signals, and so there was indeed nothing positive for him to hear. Unfortunately, the Europeans are spending all their efforts on convincing the Ukrainians to continue the war. We are convinced the Europeans are making a mistake from the perspective of their own future.
The Kremlin spokesperson added that Russia believes battlefield momentum remains in its favor.
The dynamic on the front is positive for us. We are advancing and getting closer to achieving our goals. But as President Vladimir Putin said, we are open to a diplomatic settlement.
A senior Ukrainian official told the Financial Times that Russia was not serious about ending the war because it continues to insist on demands Kiev cannot accept, while adding that Ukraine would wait and see whether Washington's growing focus on Iran affects diplomatic contacts. As the war continues with no clear resolution in sight, the question of who will ultimately sit at the negotiating table remains unresolved. For now, Russia's message suggests that Europe may find itself on the sidelines of any future peace process, even as the consequences of the conflict continue to be felt most acutely on the continent itself.